So the situation with this client was they had a business that was mostly sold through dealerships, and the new world is it's mostly going to be sold through e-commerce. So they went and very quickly decided that they needed to build an e-commerce capability from end to end. What happened is they ended up ramping up. They weren't getting throughput fast enough. They added teams, so they were up to like 30 teams across 4 or 5 vendors. They're all building software that ultimately needs to take and turn, a interest on the website into an order into cash, right? It needs to go through that overall process. And they got to the point where the more people they tried to add, the slower they got, not the faster. The more they built software, the quality went down, not up. So they started needing to do some things to fix it. And so one of the things they did is they started adding architecture to make sure, like what they'd find is they had something, and then the attributes of their product changed. So they ended up like having to rework a bunch of code. So then they made their architecture such that it was really robust and everything could change, right? So they ended up kind of over-architecting it to try to future-proof it so they never had to rewrite things, so they never had a quality issue, right? But the problem is if you try to predict the future, you're going to fail, and you're going to build a whole lot of software that just creates dependencies and slows everyone down, right? They introduced, complex management systems, right? So in order to get approval for this team to make a change, they had to get all the other teams to agree, and you can imagine how that slowed things down and increased lead times. Like if I had a new idea, the time between we had a new idea or request from the business and we could start building code was just getting longer and longer because of all the things people had to try to think of ahead of time. And there were heavy integration cycles from when the developer believed the code was written to it got in production was months and months and months. And it had to go through environments. By the time someone found a problem and it went back, no one remembered what they had done, and that company that was working on it might be onto a different problem or no longer as a team in this big program. So this is kind of how we found the team, kind of what the current reality was. Anyone, you don't have to kind of reflect some realities you guys have run into in the past? Yeah. So the first thing we had to do was get a vision of, well, where do we want to go, right? And so a lot of it was what we just talked about, right? We want to have these areas of the system. They can move at the speed those areas of the business are changing. So if the way you configure the product is changing rapidly and the ways you can pay for it aren't changing, we don't have to have all of these departments dependent on each other, or if they're going in different directions. So how do we have the different components separated, right? Ultimately, how do we modernize this, right? So someone talked earlier about having smaller components. How do we have tests and DevOps and builds around it, right? And then how do we get the kind of the engineering up to the level of the application modernization? So the first thing we really did was we looked at what are the capabilities of these teams, and how do we organize teams around those capabilities. So we may have had 2 vendors working on parts of the system that were all part of the same capability. So how do we align that to organizationally so that the business requests tended to map to the same team that they were being served by? So a lot of that was kind of insourcing the things into the company that needed to be insourced, but then in the process of insourcing that, they were afraid to bring it in from the vendor because they didn't know how the system worked. So that's when we built tests, we built mocks, we let them get to where they had a system of trust around that system. And then when they started enhancing it, they didn't fear changing it as much as they had in the past, right? ultimately, once we got to the point where the teams had less external dependencies, less external orchestration required, now we could get productivity back into the teams. So the teams could look at, well, instead of spending time trying to escalate everything outside, where are we spending time? Their retrospectives became more effective. Their internal improvements became more effective because they weren't constrained by all of these external dependencies. And ultimately, we were able to start changing how they brought in talent and what they valued, because instead of valuing someone who knew a particular technology or knew a particular industry, they could bring in people that knew how to write software, how to build tests, how to manage for change, and they didn't have to go hire so many different specialists. They could bring in people who more understood how to solve problems, and then they would use whatever tools were the right tools to solve those. In the end, like very quickly, we were able to get a lot of results. So this is probably a worst case scenario where you got all these vendors and they're all trying to work on the thing at the same time. But the first thing is, like, we went from almost no automated test coverage to 93% automated test coverage, right? And we had 70% decrease in defects. It doesn't mean that there weren't the same problems in the code. It was they were discovered before they left the team. So the team, if you build something and then you're immediately told, hey, that doesn't quite work, it's very fast to fix it. If you're told 3 months later, hey, that thing you were working on over there doesn't seem to be working, it could take you days to just remember what you were doing and get it all back up in your environment. We ultimately, the cycle time, because of so much less orchestration required, was 9 times faster. The productivity, we were getting a lot more work out of, so we ended up reducing the team size, because at some point adding people wasn't the constraint. If we got rid of the dependencies, with less people, we got more software out the door. Waste, there were good stats on what we decided not to do, because when they were afraid, we get 2 releases a year, they had to have everything in that release that the customer could possibly want. When we got to monthly releases, then they said, well, let's get this in, and then we'll do a session with them to find out what they see is missing. And now, so there's a lot more of work, that was not done, right? And so, that's a big reduction in waste. And then from an employee morale perspective, they used to be the group that everyone fled to other areas of the organization. And once they felt that they had control over their own destiny, once they were seeing that they were able to control how the software was written, they started to get people wanting to come to work for them, and the people who were there felt that they actually could make a difference, and see something that they wrote in production being used by a user. And ultimately, they got the software out faster, which was their number one issue, but then by insourcing it and having a smaller team, they were able to save millions of dollars. And now that's kind of an enduring practice. There's still a fair amount of code that if they haven't had to enhance it or it hasn't broken, it still doesn't have tests, it still doesn't have all the things we would want it to have. But at the seams between the teams, and as they're changing things, they've got good coverage and they're getting good results.